Okay, so my name is Marie Massey-Arand. I am co-founder of phaware Global Association, and I was first introduced to the world of pulmonary hypertension when my daughter Chloe was diagnosed when she was 8 months old. It was 1994, and a very unusual time for pulmonary hypertension because it was a very unknown disease, and my daughter was accidentally diagnosed. She was born missing her aorta, and she required a heart surgery. And when they went in for pre-op testing to make sure that everything was okay, they inadvertently found abnormally high pressures in her lungs, which is what pulmonary hypertension is. And they came back and they said to me, "I'm sorry, we can't do her surgery. We're going to have to let her die." And I was sent home, told that she would maybe make it until she was 2 years old. And that was it. Ultimately, Chloe became the first person ever to be put in an operating room using the only drug in existence, this prostacyclin, while in clinical trials, and managed to survive that surgery. She was a year and a half old, and that allowed me to have another 12 and a half years with Chloe, and gave her the opportunity to know all of her brothers and sisters. And it was really just a huge risk. She was patient number one. And for me, what it does now is it means that Chloe's spirit still lives here with us, because she did this very brave, she basically gave her life to be able to advance medicine without even knowing she was doing it. So that's how I got introduced to clinical trials. There's my introduction into what is a clinical trial. A doctor who I barely know asks me if I'll take a risk, and the risk is ultimately going to either end my daughter's life or save my daughter's life. And fortunately for me and for many other people, it saved my daughter's life. A year later, I'm pretty sure, maybe a year and a half later, that prostacyclin was approved and became the first approved medication for pulmonary hypertension patients. It is still used today. It's still used today in the form that it's in, and it's also used in other forms. So my journey was that I went on and had 4 more children and was living my life and living with a child with PH, and very different than it is now. We were checked, Chloe was checked went to clinic every 6 months. Chloe had a cardiac cath either every 6 months, or sometimes, if we were lucky, once a year. People go way longer than that now, having to have tests of that magnitude. In 2006, Chloe unfortunately got a bad case of tonsillitis, and we went in for a routine tonsillectomy, and she got septic. She passed away from what they called complications from a tonsillectomy. If it weren't for the very first clinical trial, I wouldn't have had my child here. And I can tell you that probably the most brilliant thing for me is that my other 4 children knew Chloe and have memories of Chloe, and without that, they wouldn't be the people they are today. In the pulmonary hypertension world, beginning in 1994, when we were in our first clinical trial, to now, we have 14 approved medications. That's a lot for a rare disease. And last year, we had the first approved for children. And when I came back into the PH space, pulmonary hypertension space, I was a little up in arms, to say the least, that my daughter was in the very first clinical trial when she was 8 months old, and there was not an approved medication for kids. And both of my business partners had kids who had PH, right? So we're all caregivers of children who have pulmonary hypertension, and there's no drugs that are approved for them. So it was almost just about a year ago, I woke in the morning to a text message from a former coworker, and she forwarded me that the first pediatric PH drug had been approved. And I was barely awake, and I cried. And then I texted all of my kids, and I forwarded them the article, and I said to them, wherever you are tonight, and we were all in different places, we're having an ice cream party to celebrate. Big deal for me. big deal. My mom owned an ice cream store for 20 years, so ice cream is like we have it for breakfast, like ice cream is our thing in our house. So we actually have a FaceTime photograph of all of us in all different places, sitting together, having ice cream, and talking about how far we've come, how we could go from absolutely nothing to now children can safely be on this medication. And what that means is that everybody else has to step up, right? Once it happens once, then all those other drugs have to be looked at. And what do they mean for kids? And so that was a game changer. Fortunately for me, we affected Chloe's life and then the future generations. But I think it's really important to understand that when somebody is sick and they're really trying to look for something to help themselves, in trying to help yourself, you may be helping a much larger group of people. And I think my kind of perfect example of this is Chloe is in the clinical trials for a prostacyclin. Fast forward all these years later, and I meet my business partner, John. John's son was diagnosed when he was 6, and he immediately went on that medication. But for me, the idea that way back when we started this thing, and then I meet this child who I love dearly, and he is living because of what my daughter did, what we chose to do. It doesn't get any better than that. It really doesn't. That's what a clinical trial means. A clinical trial means, what does it mean for the future?